Hi.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good, 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 good. Thank you so much for joining. It's 2 a.m. here in the UK. It's windy as heck outside, but I hear it's pretty terrible in Florida at the moment, so I can't complain. But yes, welcome to our UFO Twitter week space. Um, it's been a busy week, so hopefully we'll dive into it. The space will start filling up in the next couple of minutes, and we will have a co-host joining shortly. But I just wanted to say a big thank you from me for popping in. We'll be probably running. Well, how long have we got you for, Matthew?
Until I run out of steam. And I guess
Oh,
it's 2 a.m. your time, so that's probably more of a constraint. So
don't worry, I had a space the other night at I think 3 a.m. I certainly looked a bit strange in work the next day. I've sat in a very corporate job, and why do you look so tired? Well, I was up discussing the UAP topic, guys. Was an interesting topic of conversation. So yeah, as the space is starting to fill up, I think we should just dive into it. You should know, Matthew, this is probably the most. Can't get my words out. We've had the most amount of people set this space as a reminder, so no pressure. Not at all. So, thank you again. It would be great. There's a lot of new people into our community of late who might not know you, your background, what you're about. So, I just wonder if we could do a little whistle stop tour of you, your background, and then we could go from there.
yeah, sounds good.
Cool. Fire
Certainly.
away.
So yes. So my background took an unconventional route to where I got today, but started undergrad. I did physics and philosophy degrees, focused on trying to become a physicist until I realized what being a practicing physicist really entailed, and I had an early midlife crisis at 21 and sort of did a hard pivot to sort of science policy, interned on the Hill after doing a bunch of lab work and sort of physics work. Graduated during the financial crisis. Didn't want to go to get a PhD, so went over to London to do a master's at the London School of Economics, essentially just stalling for time. Came back to the States, got a 2-year fellowship at the National Science Foundation, where I helped manage kind of the distribution of grants for a number of programs, including all the sort of economics discipline grants, sort of the game theory, decision risk management sciences, and sort of science of organizations. That was sort of a feeder to do a PhD in economics. But after that 2 years, decided that wasn't the path for me. Uh, Found my way sort of stumbling into doing consulting for the government. Had a buddy who I met at a trivia night, and I was looking for a job at the end of my fellowship, and he said, "Hey, why don't you just come join us? We'll give you a clearance. You get some decent salary, and you can get to do some interesting work while you figure out, whether you want to go to law school or whatever." I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And so that kind of got me into that world, and so I started working on a sort of a set of programs for a small company that sort of had a niche for certain work for the government, essentially assessing how prepared the government is for sort of worst case scenarios. And so this had kind of two main components, essentially doing exercises. So it was like crisis simulations. Those can take place at either sort of discussion level with small group participants, or full scale thousands of participants, including the president and the cabinet. And so I, did a lot of those exercises, evaluated a lot of those exercises, and on the other side, I did a lot of the sort of more analytic work, sort of assessments of national preparedness, sort of program evaluations, including evaluations of our more sensitive programs on continuity of government, sort of how can we ensure the government can survive under sort of worst case scenarios. And so I jumped around from project to project. I was kind of I was a bit more of a, I guess, a utility player. So I jumped from a lot of different sort of contracts across multiple agencies. Um, Towards the second half of that sort of government consulting career, I did a lot of work on sort of operational experimentation for emerging technology, sort of helping to first kind of understand kind of where direction of travel is in different technologies, sort of horizon scanning, and then helping identify kind of what are the operational requirements for different mission sets and different end users and different scenarios, and then actually designing and conducting, different field experiments to bring, candidate technologies out into the field, whether it's, out in the desert or on the ocean, to sort of test them in realistic scenarios. And so I did that sort of work for, about 10 plus years before I got sick and tired of doing consulting for the government, dealing with the bureaucracy and government shutdowns every 9 months, et cetera, and joined a sort of a more boutique firm in the private sector that focused on sort of management consulting at the intersection of geopolitical and cybersecurity risk. And so I joined that firm about 3 years ago, and our clients were mostly multinationals, sort of critical technology companies, where they sort of are facing increasingly challenging geopolitical risk environment, as well as the rising specter of cyber attacks, ransomware, nation states trying to steal their stuff. And so been doing that as the director of intelligence for that firm. That firm was acquired by a publicly traded cybersecurity company, and we became kind of the strategic advisory group. And so that's kind of my day job. I've been leading essentially the strategic intelligence practice for that. So important proviso. These are my views, not those of my employer. That's like my professional kind of arc. Certainly on the UAP side, I've had more of a personal interest.
That was
So I said,
definitely my next question. So with such a wonderful career under your belt, and I'm sure very much in the future, how on earth did you collide with the phenomena as such? So yeah.
yeah, so it all came, I think I had an interest, in high school, as a physics nerd. So I read The Hunt for Zero Point. And I'd say my latent assumption in that era was that, UFOs, quote unquote, really, were most likely, misidentifications of conventional, aircraft, or the, signs of some secret U.S. government programs. That was kind of like my baseline assumption, in high school. And I kind of forgot about it going to college. Although looking back on it, because I was such a weird physics nerd on sort of AOL dial-up, I was actually reading some of the papers that Hal Puthoff and Jack Sarfati had posted. Again, no obvious connection that I made at the time to UFOs or anything like that. I just thought it was just some interesting, physics papers, and people had some, potentially sort of heterodox ideas. So yeah, Sarfati, Puthoff, I think Eric Davis even popped up in that sort of teenage reading. Henry Stapp was a sort of heterodox physicist at Los Alamos. So yeah, I was that kind of kid. So but maybe that primed me later on, but I kind of mostly forgot about it over the course of my career. And I never directly encountered anything that during my, consulting work for the government, stuck out to me as like an obvious hint of some, secret government program or anything like that. And I've held TSSCI and, cleared into a variety of different compartments. But nothing, professionally tangential to anything that I saw as being, related to UFOs. So yeah, no, for me, it was more the 2017 article that kind of perked my interest. I knew how the government machine worked. I knew how the Pentagon, the intelligence community, I kind of, I'd seen that beast for a while, and so I was, obviously very much surprised to hear and learn about the nature of these activities, and sort of have been paying attention to it since then. I think it was the 2020 article in the New York Times that quoted Eric Davis on, briefing the Senate on recoveries of sort of off-world technologies, and I was like, well, that's certainly interesting. And so that kind of maybe got me more focused on it analytically as a sort of a puzzle to piece together. And, I guess that has just sort of cascaded from there. So yeah,
And
that's
it, and here you are on UFO Twitter Week.
Yeah, I wonder what got you to start talking publicly about it, because I think that's another thing is, to talk publicly about it on platforms and then to not. Like, what made you do that?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think I had my first like real UFO thread probably over 3 years ago. I guess I didn't have as much of a following then. But no, I basically wrote like a full on thread. It was like a two-parter, maybe 30 or 40 like long tweets. That was like my first attempt to kind of put together like my assessment of the situation back then. So that was, just trying to suss out things that, folks like Lou Elizondo had said. And this, I think, was before most of the, National Defense Authorization Acts had really gotten going. Maybe the first one was being, sort of whispered about, but it was really in the context of kind of the 2020 stuff. And then I forget to go back and see the exact timing. So no, I was never like shy. I was never shying away from talking about it. I guess no one really, cared about what I was saying. And so, yeah, I guess people, if they ask me, I'll give them my thoughts. And depending on the nature of social media, some things amplify and some things don't. And so, I guess for whatever reason, more recently, those same sorts of thoughts have been amplified more significantly than they had been before. So, yeah, I didn't make like a sudden decision to come out now. Like I've been talking about this stuff for a while. It just, maybe resonated in a different way.
Do you see the last couple of years as significant in taking place, or in what you've been looking at the topic overall from the last couple of years of the developments?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, that's been one of the most remarkable features of it that has continued to draw my attention and accelerate, the level of significance that I ascribe to this thing is, just on one narrow dimension. If you just look at the progression of the language in the National Defense Authorization Acts, which is something that I followed professionally before, is the government sends, especially Congress, sends strong signals about what sorts of defense and security programs and priorities they want to fund. And especially when you're a government contractor, you have to kind of try to skate where the puck is going. And so I was familiar kind of with the process and the sausage making for the National Defense Authorization Act and the Intelligence Authorization Act, and the structure of the committees and the nature of the sort of oversight to the beast of the defense industrial base and the intelligence community. And so, yeah, I was remarking, internally and then externally, as the scope and tenor of how folks in Congress, especially folks on the Senate side, Gillibrand and Rubio, but also including Gallagher and a number of other folks that have sort of perked up since then, we're introducing quite suggestive bills into the National Defense Authorization Act and passing them into law. And so I was closely tracking kind of the sequence from FY21, FY22 up through the stand up of Arrow and the variety of different reports and kind of all the brouhaha over Arrow and the Senate and all that stuff. So that was like one track that is obviously in a more public setting is clear evidence of something happening, right? Some structural trend underway. There's some obviously something driving that behind the scenes. And then I think if maybe just as a result of me being public about some of these ideas, I've been fortunate to have a number of folks reach out to me and had lots of interesting relationships forged over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, the last like year or two in particular, where folks of pretty significant you know um, sort of professional bona fides and responsibility. I've had conversations to sort of get a sense of, well, what do they think about this, and those have been only more intriguing in terms of the degree of seriousness with which a large set of folks that I would not have normally thought would be engaged seriously in this subject, in fact are. And so that has just continued as a progression of more deep and strong sort of high trust relationships and conversations, and trying to puzzle out exactly what is going on here. So that's been maybe like more of a personal curiosity. I don't have any. I don't consider myself like an activist in some sense. I don't. I guess my latent sort of disposition is more as like an analyst, and trying to observe and understand first before trying to figure out how to interpret what sorts of implications this might be. But yeah, one key motivation I have formed in the last like year or two, as I became increasingly convinced that this is very serious and this is very real, is to then put on my more is to put on like my other professional hats and my sort of intellectual hats, and trying to think about, okay, well, I just happen to have developed maybe a somewhat idiosyncratic combination of a physics and philosophy academic background. So, my orientation was always towards these more fundamental questions and, trying to think them through in a rigorous way. But then a professional career sort of in the national security space and emerging technology. And a large portion of that was sort of working on worst case scenario planning for the government. And so maybe just by happenstance, those things all kind of, I think, are quite relevant when you're considering this topic. And so I guess that has sort of primed me in a variety of ways to uh, have thoughts and continue to have thoughts on the subject.
What do you think, Matt, is what factors do you believe are really delaying full transparency, in your opinion?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I
It's
missed
my
some
very
part of
English Scouse accent. In your opinion, what factors do you believe are delaying a full transparency, a disclosure coming out.
Like, what's the biggest obstacle? Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, well, I
amongst
mean,
many.
yeah, I mean that's a complicated question. I would say so it's almost like consider the counterfactual of the past, say, since 2017. You could imagine an alternative history where there was no Tom DeLonge conversation with Podesta and the generals. There was no TTSA. There was no Lou Elizondo taking up the mantle inside the Pentagon. There was no Christopher Mellon getting videos in the New York Times. Like, you can consider that as like maybe a contingency in history, right? Maybe it would have come out in a slightly different way. But I try to answer that question by just looking at like what has actually happened when we try to think about like what are the tangible political and social moves that we've seen over the last several years that we would call like in the direction of disclosure. Obviously not what folks would, I think, categorize as being capital D disclosure, for whatever that means. But it seems like there has been a direction of travel. And I think the implication or my assessment of that is that there are some folks that are motivated and in positions of influence to execute some of their plans to accomplish what they see as the objective to partially disclose some of this information. I put Lou and Chris Mellon and those sorts of folks kind of in that camp. But then I think it's pretty obvious though that like not all of their plans have been successful, and so there's been resistance to some of those plans. Some of it's been pretty obvious, right? Just the normal organizational intransigence inside the Pentagon, not wanting to be embarrassed, not wanting to have to answer questions that they really don't have good answers for. But then I think it's become more clear, and I think Lou has come hard in the paint with his book releases to point the finger at very specific elements in our power structure and our institutional bureaucratic system of individuals, groups of individuals that have a strong interest in not having more information on the subject come out. And I think Lewis pointed at two stipulated categories of groups, right? The quote unquote Collins elite that have a certain sort of religious orientation that wants them to suppress any public discussion or even official government investigation of the subject, and then of course the big kahuna, the quote legacy program folks, which obviously for natural reasons have an interest in keeping those activities entirely behind the curtain. And so that's basically my assessment: is that there are just competing power structures, folks that have positions of relative influence are willing that to accomplish their objectives. And I think the observation I have over the past 6 or 7 years is that at least there's been partial success relative to say the last 80. And I have no predictions on exactly how this will play out, but it's a contest between different factions, if you want to call it that, or folks that are on different sides of this question, and they're wielding their influence. So like I know like that's like the more practical assessment, is it just essentially is an all too human explanation of different folks have different different humans have different motivations and they're in positions of power, or that power may be decaying. I mean, my observation with the whole David Grush incident, from the perspective of the national security sort of bureaucracy, was that they did not count on a extremely intelligent, partially autistic, physics and intelligence officer deciding he's actually going to do a good job, right? This millennial do-gooder was going to be like, I will do this assignment extremely well. I will do the mission that's been tasked to me by Congress and my superiors, and I will actually go and try to answer this question. And I'm not going to let people kind of like try to throw sand in my eyes here. And so he did. And so he did his job. Like, I think my larger observation over like the sweep of the last several decades is that I think there's been a general decay in state capacity and institutions across the board. And I think that probably has affected the legacy program quote unquote gatekeepers the same way, right? Just their ability to hold on to this has not been as successful as maybe it had been in the past. For
Well, what do
maybe
you
a
think
whole,
about it seems like there's a current game being played between Arrow and that method of which that was set up, and the whistleblowers, and this whole catastrophic disclosure, different route that needs to be. How do you see that kind of playing out and played out?
Could you clarify the question? I'll just make sure I answer it
Just with
correctly.
Arrow, so Arrow was the office that was set up, and the
Mm-hmm.
whistleblowers now have come forward and they've published a historical report, essentially saying that there's nothing extraterrestrial in which I feel like Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo a lot of this up, and now they've sort of had to take another route because these whistleblowers, who essentially the firsthand whistleblowers that David Grush worked with and interviewed, haven't come forward to Arrow, and now are looking for another way that an alternative in which it has been set up. Are you familiar with kind of how that's been set up and how you see that
Mhm.
playing out?
Yeah, so I think my assessment of sort of what's been happening in sort of the formal bureaucratic side of this over the last several years, starts with I think some key figures on the Senate, getting privately, maybe informally briefed on there's a there here, and they were sufficiently motivated to start passing some laws, and they pushed for and got the creation of the UAP task force under the Office of Naval Intelligence, and that was a serious effort, right? I think just recently was the org chart kind of released by the government. You could see, it was a serious, structured, organized effort across multiple agencies. It was, I've seen how these sorts of task force get structured. Like, they have an institutional momentum. Once they get stood up, they have reporting requirements. People get, detailed. There's, it's like any government bureaucracy. But they started then doing their job, and I think maybe did their job too well, right? Folks like Grush and Carl Nell and others that were assigned to that did their job well and identified a number of things that I think has then triggered then the sort of sequence of follow-on moves. My read of the creation of Arrow was, I think, Gillibrand, who's, I think, motivated in good faith here. I think her first order of priority here wasn't quote unquote disclosure. It was trying to put in place a more formal mechanism of accountability and transparency to Congress, right? Especially to the Senate Armed Services and the intelligence committees. And so, senior political officials, right? The thing that most offends them is not being told something that they feel like they have a right to know, or not having control over how money is spent that they feel they should have, actual power to allocate. And so I think she set up Arrow, and I think her objective and her colleagues' objectives was to sort of create a mechanism, a more formal mechanism than the UAPTF, like an established in law office that would owe them, regular updates and reports, including some public reports, but that would allow them to maybe try to get like a bureaucratic anchor inside the Pentagon in particular. But obviously, the objective was to have it be essentially a joint office with ODNI, and try to build on that as essentially a bridgehead to try to get some better accountability and maybe leverage over what they were increasingly learning of as the contours of this quote unquote legacy program. Um, but as you look at the history of Washington, right, there's kind of a power asymmetry between politicians who write things in laws and these very complex and sort of somewhat autonomous bureaucratic structures who find clever ways to kind of meet the legislative intent while effectively sort of neutering its teeth. And I think that's basically what happened. As sort of Arrow was effectively subverted from within from meeting maybe that original purpose. Although the actual architecture that Kirkpatrick, nominally established, if you read the mission overview briefing, pretty much, if you look at the different sort of divisions or groups that he set up inside Arrow, it looks almost like somewhat isomorphic to what you would expect the legacy program compartments to represent. Right, it had both crash retrieval, essentially recovery sort of functions. It had science and technology, like including outreach and engagement with frontier physicists and sort of cutting edge theoretical physics. It had sort of an analytic group. It had operations group. It had kind of a whole set of discrete functions that you if you're trying to sort of almost find a way to kind of set up a more formal umbrella structure that could maybe absorb or create dashed lines to this other more opaque structure. That is like a way that you could imagine doing that. But I think for maybe more reasons of personality, Kirkpatrick kind of was not suited to that role, and I think irritated people sufficiently, including the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And when you make her unhappy as well as senior senators, you're not long for this world. And so but these things play out in bureaucratic time, not necessarily in Twitter time. And so it's just a very slow process, even if the objectives are necessarily changing. And so that's my read of Arrow, essentially, is that it was, and I think that's my interpretation of things as as it stands today. I think they, Arrow is still Gillibrand and Rubio's baby to a certain extent. I think they still want it to succeed. I think that's not something they're just going to give up on because it exists now, and so the game is to try to then steer it back towards its original purpose. And I think the new director Kozlowski, they're trying to put shake the Etch-a-Sketch essentially, and put maybe a different reputation there. It's going to be very difficult, I think, though, because I think there was a maybe a merited suspicion that Arrow was functioning as almost like a catch and kill operation. They weren't seriously investigating the reports and detailed evidence and specific targets that had been given to them. Right, here are the program names, here are the program managers, here are the program facilities, here's the legitimate special access programs that are being used illegally potentially to cover these unreported UAP related activities. And maybe there's doors that they could have knocked on that they decided not to knock on. I mean, Kirkpatrick has said that he went and essentially asked all the people
He
that
didn't
were.
push it, right? Like I didn't feel like he was forceful. Yeah, in the interview he was talking about, he was like, hey, you guys got this? Okay, yep, see you later."
Yeah, I mean that's basically you could see it as nefarious. You could also see it as like typical government bureaucrat who's going to do the bare minimum unless someone forces him to, right? Like he had no personal incentive to like go and he was not a David Grush, right? He was a senior. He's close to retirement. He wants to get a cushy job. He has no incentive to try to poke any bears, right? Now people might read that more in a more malign fashion that he was actually working on behalf of folks to cover it up. I don't know. I don't have evidence one way or the other. But I think it was clear that he was not as proactive as he could have been. But even then, he didn't necessarily have like the legal authorities to compel testimony, right? He didn't. No one that was was signing these statements was doing so under penalty of perjury, right? So any of these folks from the different programs or contracting organizations weren't they could basically say whatever they want, and they might even have legal cover for their special access programs to do so, at the same time, right? So, yeah, that's where you get into like the Byzantine maze of the SAPs and the CAPs and how those are structured inside the DoD and the IC. And he had, I think, quote unquote, full access to all of those SAPs, including NASA's SAPs. But just because you have access doesn't mean you're actually going to doggedly pursue an investigation, right? Those are very different things. And so he was kind of doing more about what I would say is like a check the box drill as opposed to a rigorous investigation. I think also the whistleblowers who were rightly concerned for retaliation, given what had happened to Lou and Grush. They certainly didn't trust Arrow to be a good steward of their protected disclosures and their personal testimony. And so, in the absence of that structure, then being a mechanism to feed the true high fidelity and sensitive information to Congress, it sort of found its own way to Congress. Right? Some went through the ICIG, some gave direct testimony, and so that's been the process, right? But that only goes so far, right? And that's, I think, ultimately what culminated in the introduction of the UAP Disclosure Act, right? And senior staffers got together, and Schumer and Rounds, et cetera, Heinrich, Young, Gillibrand, and they decided this is an important, formal step that needs to be taken. And that's kind of where we are now, right? Like we are kind of in this political process. So I'm not an expert on the behind the scenes machinations by any means, but that's kind of my TLDR on kind of the bureaucratic kind of evolution of these things.
Thanks, Matt.
But yeah,
Oh.
I realized that I never actually answered a question about catastrophic disclosure.
No, that was great. That was a great
It was a
assessment
great
of the
answer.
situation. Yeah.
Steph, you had a question for Matt?
Hi, Matt. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can.
Yep.
Okay, good. I was going to ask about regarding Kirkpatrick, but you actually kind of covered it about his ability and access to the programs, but you kind of explained that he did have adequate access, but he might have just been kind of checking the box. And I'm also kind of curious about, because you ended on the UAP, UAPDA type stuff. I'm just wondering, like, how do you see, like, realistically, we try and keep ufology as a whole generally like apolitical kind of, and keep it not too like to the right or to the left. Do you think that that is a like a reasonable expectation going into the election coming up? And do you think, like, how many iterations do you think of like something like the UAPDA could one like realistically expect to see before meaningful legislation gets passed? Thanks.
I think the first one's easier answer than the second one. I think, in general, I think the topic isn't inherently political and very difficult to politicize. But I think it's mainly a function of who's in power, right? Right. So I think if it was a Republican administration and there was sort of hold everything else equal, I think the valence would be flipped, and then you would have a lot of folks pushing for Podesta to come in and be more vocal, or other folks on the Democratic side to kind of like leverage their political sort of opposition to the existing administration to try to get some more visibility and high level kind of introduction of this topic into the public discourse. But right now you have a Democratic administration in charge of the White House, and the folks inside the White House, like their first priority is just to like try to contain the continuous chaos in the world, right? And so your default is not to push for anything that's going to give you more problems. And so I think, at least I've heard, I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard with a reasonably good confidence that Jake Sullivan is, clued in on some aspects of this and was trying to do what he could to a certain extent, but he's also trying to prevent World War III. He's trying to essentially run a country with a bunch of senior officials that aren't necessarily being checked by I'd say really strong commander in chief. Just is kind of a physiological fact at this point, and so I think that has left this kind of on the back burner from the point of view of the White House. And so in the absence of that, that's given space for Congress to kind of push in whatever direction they feel is appropriate. But I think if you just look at the folks involved, it's a pretty wide representation. You've got like AOC, and and folks that are calling for a much very different political vision. And so at least that's somewhat optimistic from my perspective, that you've got a pretty broad bipartisan representation here. Even on the UAPDA, you've got a bipartisan set of folks there. Schumer Rounds showing great comedy in their floor speech. So I don't see this as being necessarily a political issue. The one thing I think that I've noticed just in tracking some of the public discourse here is that in general, the quote right is accused of being a bit more conspiratorial, right? Everything from back to QAnon, but just in general, kind of the rhetorical orientation, and a lot of the right is cast by the left of our political discourse as being inherently more suspicious of the state, suspicious of the current sort of power structure, and so always pointing at different conspiracies, whether it's some conspiracies are true conspiracies, but kind of objectively they're the distinction in their political behavior is I think does align more closely to being inherently more suspicious of of the government or sort of these existing power structures. And so I think that may explain why sort of RFK, who's I think very curious and motivated on this subject, has moved into the Trump camp on this question. But I don't know; these things are very somewhat transient, or they can flip very quickly. I've also heard on the other side, Podesta has obviously been a pretty strong proponent of disclosure for a while. I think that's now pretty clear given the evidentiary record that going back to the Tom DeLonge emails, I think he's still involved somehow in this subject, and so he's a top power broker inside the Democratic administration. So I don't just see this as being caught up on any particular political fence. And I don't think that necessarily is going to be the main function of the resistance inside Congress. I mean, I think I know Lester's down there. I mean, he tracks the details of this more than I do. But I think the UAPDA may have just been a victim of some procedural issues. It could still come back potentially. Whatever happens in conference. I don't know. I don't try to handicap the political machinations in election year. What they'll try to do. I think a lot of it depends on what the results of the election are and who's going to take power. What that would mean for different sort of leadership assignments in the relevant committees. and which now span in the UAPDA, and it's not just Senate Armed Services and the Intel, but also the oversight committees. So there's like a lot of big egos from different parts of the of Capitol Hill, and unfortunately, like any legislation is going to go through sausage, like the sausage process. So, but I think in general, I think what you're seeing is a pretty persistent signaling from the relevant folks that they're not going to give up on it. I think this will remain just a thing that's negotiated, and it'll be a victim of our larger political cycle. But that's just like the political track. I think it's an important one, but I don't know. It's not like the only thing that's going to be relevant, I think, over the next year.
So on that note, real quick, just a quick follow up. So I know that it's, these things like the UAPDA are, it matters differently to different people. And a lot of people I feel like kind of get caught up on this notion of we don't need government disclosure. And they're kind of like weaving in the UAPDA with this notion of government disclosure. What do you think is, you know, uh, if not for something like the UAPDA, like and we all just kind of agreed as the citizens of the United States, our humanity, that NHI exists, and we don't need official sanction disclosure. What is the danger of that as far as like allowing things like loopholes or programs or stuff like that within the government unchecked to run amok? Like, can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about why that's important?
Yeah, and I think if you read the UAPDA closely, including the findings and declarations at the beginning, and then of course the relevant provisions, which it's not just a bill to basically say, hey, we're going to collect all these different government records, and we're going to convene an expert panel to go through those government records, and then they're going to represent all these instruments of national power, as Carl now has described, and in a methodical and a deliberative fashion with presidential kind of veto and mechanisms for um, some accountability there. They're going to disclose to the public relevant information on a presumption that it should be released. And so if it was just that, then it would just be sort of quote unquote a disclosure bill, right? But there's other provisions that are much more in the lane of what you could consider essentially, trying to establish a formal institutional mechanism to get accountability over what is perceived by some elements of national leadership as essentially a rogue group, right? Folks that are not responding to the constitutional prerogatives that are established in our system of government. And so this is where the provisions for eminent domain and subpoena and essentially referral to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution if they resist a subpoena, to in the findings and declarations basically say that the use of the Atomic Energy Act secrecy provisions has been inappropriately expanded to cover these records using those provisions and designating things essentially as transclassified foreign nuclear information. So essentially accusing parts of the government or contractors that are working on behalf of the government of essentially abusing their authorities, of not meeting their legal and constitutional obligations. And that is less of a quote unquote disclosure problem. It's an inherent kind of balance of power. And you could almost read it as potentially a constitutional crisis, right? If there are significant elements of the intelligence and defense community that are sort of flagrantly violating the color of the law, and that the national leadership, including elected officials in both the legislative and executive branch, have not been made aware as they should be. Well, there's only two elected officials in the executive branch, right? The president and the vice president. And so that to me is the more like sort of red flashing light here, right? Is okay, like there's serious people inside the Senate that have serious reason to believe that there are essentially rogue activities being conducted without the proper mechanisms of legislative and executive oversight. Not just legislative, but executive oversight, meaning the constitutional officers that we elect to positions of national responsibility, the commander in chief in particular, has not been fully apprised of these activities. And that is a critical problem, right? That is a problem for the inherent legitimacy of a democratic form of government. I think even Lou has made very pointed references to this problem. So I think that's almost the first priority. If I am, senior senator, or if I'm someone at the White House, is I can't really disclose the information that I don't really have I don't have full control over. right? And so I think that is the problem that has to be addressed first, before you could think about, okay, well, what would be the right mechanism to release some information. But that's again still almost on the assumption that all the relevant information is only housed inside these legacy programs, right? And I think that is, certainly I would expect there's probably a lot more systematic knowledge that's been accrued as a result of continuous investigation by by these programs over many decades. It's far advancing what's now sort of leaked into the public domain through a variety of open source researchers. But I think folks that take this problem seriously and that consult what's already in the public domain can kind of come to a pretty high confidence conclusion that it's likely that these technologies of unknown origin exist. They haven't actually taken them into physical possession themselves to inspect their materials and their mechanisms of manufacture. But are reasonable enough to kind of have enough people join a call like this and feel like this is a serious political issue to push forward. So I think that is just like on a spectrum, right? There's folks that are paying close attention, that have sort of already reached their own internal sort of epistemic threshold. And there's lots of folks that just haven't, right? And so when you say disclosure, usually you mean kind of like everyone just watching CNN basically on, at the airport is like, oh, wait, aliens are real or some whatever, right? Like that sort of flip that happens. And I don't even know if the folks pushing for disclosure kind of even want that as part of the plan, right? Or as part of whatever their overall objective is. I mean, I don't speak for Lou, but I don't even think he wants there to be like this, let's just take everything and throw it out into the public. I think he's like, there are certain facts, especially the fact of non-human intelligence, that is not a fact that the U.S. government has a moral or even legal right to withhold, right? It's just sort of the nature of intelligence in the cosmos. This is not government information. It's not a government source or method. It's not a government sort of capability. So I think the folks inside these legacy programs and the folks that are pushing back on these movements towards disclosure, I think one of the strongest arguments to folks like Senator Rounds has been, well, these two aspects of kind of releasing some information on NHI and admitting at least maybe provisionally that this something is more exotic going on here, that it potentially is going to unspool threads that will potentially compromise critical national security advantages, right? And I think that's an argument that folks inside Congress are very attentive to, right? They don't want necessarily to be blamed for compromising a strategic national capability that would be essentially a war winning or a war deterring ace in the hole sort of thing. And so those things need to be kind of like separated. But of course the folks behind in these legacy programs have every interest in kind of making sure that those are conjoined almost irreducibly. And so that's, I think, the political problem now. And that's one function of the sort of the UAP Records Review Board was to try to provide an independent mechanism to make that adjudication, to sort of act as that critical filter to sort of bypass keep the national security prerogatives intact while releasing critical information on this fact to the public. That hasn't come into law yet. And even if it does, right, it'll be a matter of how they actually adjudicate where that line is drawn to see how much information actually comes out. But yeah, I think there's a role for civil society here to and when I say civil society, I mean the broad sweep of professions that have responsibility to manage our financial system, to prepare their religious flock for a potential shift in an understanding of human history or our place in the cosmos, and scientific disciplines to reassess models of fundamental physics. And so yeah, I think there's going to be lots of action that is going to have to be brought from the private sector or from civil society kind of on its own, regardless of what happens with these political games.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to shift gears a little bit, picking up on what you've just said. Managing the potential societal disruption in the event of disclosure with a capital D. How, and your background in preparedness, perhaps, how should we prepare for the societal, the economic, the psychological disruption disclosure would have on humanity? Gosh, that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean,
in your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, so my day job, right, like early when I was doing work for the government, was thinking about sort of worst case scenarios in a more prosaic fashion. Like on one hand, you have natural disasters, right? You got hurricanes, obviously. Unfortunately, a lot of folks are dealing with that right now. You have earthquakes; those can be quite destructive. You have pandemics. We went through that, and you have sort of man-made issues. You have nuclear war. You have improvised nuclear device from terrorists. You have cyber attacks. You have biological war. So you have a large set of bad things that can happen that can hit what we will call like critical infrastructure. FEMA has a word for this, is sort of critical lifelines. The CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, identifies sort of 16 critical infrastructure sectors. These are everything from, the things that you would think of, right? So like the energy grid, right? The financial banking sort of service sector, what water, wastewater, ports, telecommunications, etc. So this is a way we sort of, as a society, have sort of bucketed the things that are critical to keep, our economy, our way of life, our society, functioning from one day to the next, right? So I think that would be, you'd have essentially a map over, well, which of those critical infrastructure sectors, which of those, key pillars of our social economic system, are more at risk from variations of disclosure, right? You would obviously do more of like a scenario analysis, right? Different permutations of how much information over what time, and then different assumptions on the individual and the mass psychological reaction. And so, just to take one example, right, there are certain critical systems that we rely on that most people don't really understand. Like, for example, FedNow and FedWire. These are the sort of the payment systems that underlie our economic system. When you pay a bill, essentially all these sort of bank to bank payments get settled on a network that's essentially is run by the Fed, and it's had like a few outages, and those are always like 5 alarm fires for people in government. But it requires people showing up for work and running that system, right? And if there are at least some subset of those people that decide for whatever reason that they're not motivated enough to come into work, or they're psychologically affected in such a way that those critical systems then are more exposed to risk. So actually, someone I know, she's written publicly about this, Helen McCaw. She was
Helen's a very dear friend of mine, so I'm so glad
yes,
you
yeah. So
brought her
she's
up.
great,
Yeah.
and she will talk to your ear off about the payment system, and I think
Yep.
she also pointed to her, on the more psychological side, like the
Hmm.
types of people that staff our technocratic administrative bureaucracies, like the Fed and similar institutions. They're the kinds of folks that I think would be um, most sort of potentially affected by disclosure, right? They're sort of usually the ones that are most self-assured in their picture of the world and their role in society, right? They have a certain one kind of professional competency. They think themselves as sort of rational, that they sort of adjudicate based off of evidence, and that they have a position of power and influence, relatively, in the sort of the professional middle class kind of technocrat place in society. I think those sorts of individuals, like the Neil deGrasse Tyson types, like I think these sorts of people would probably be most affected negatively
For sure.
by an unavoidable confrontation with the reality of non-human intelligence, and so that would be a risk that you'd have to model in. Um, and I actually think that's probably the more that would be the more like acute risk, right? So if you're thinking through risk, right, in my world, there's sort of acute risk and say structural risk, right, or
Hmm.
strategic risk, and like the acute risk is like the days, the weeks, right, around a kind of a sort of a disjunctive event, right? An unavoidable recognition, and whether it's official from the government or just comes in some sort of other exogenous fashion. And those sort of acute events are very hard to sort of prepare for or sort of model. And there, you're really just trying to build in resilience into the system, trying to build in enough buffers and enough folks in those systems in positions of responsibility within those different bureaucratic systems, that they're not totally thrown for a loop, right? So they actually do show up for work the next day, and they keep the lights on, and things just chug along, and people adapt. Because I think overall people tend to be very psychologically adaptive to lots of things, right? I mean, COVID, if you go back to the first few
Yeah.
weeks, everyone was basically losing their minds, and then a few months goes by, and some people still lost their minds. But I think overall, people adapted psychologically to that, right? Once it was clear it wasn't going to be the end of the world, and not everyone was just going to like start coughing up blood or whatever, right? I think people subsumed it into the background of their worldview, and they just got along with their day, right? Dropping their kids off from school or whatever. And so I think that's my baseline expectation. And so the risk management priority is to sort of focus on those more acute points of instability in certain critical systems, and a lot of it's a psychological activity, right? Like it's not like you're building in capital buffers in the banks like you do for a financial stress test. These are like psychological stress tests on the PMC class that is responsible for administering these critical infrastructure systems. And so that is like a doable thing. It's almost kind of maybe a subtle motivation for why I've talked about this. I would consider myself a member of that class. And I think someone like me talking about this kind of maybe subtly, almost kind of inoculates at least a subset of those individuals. And so if that's, my one contribution, then maybe that's useful.
It's a good contribution. I wonder, and I sit and, because I'm a bit of a nerd, I sit and think about the geopolitical risk if it all leads from America. Clearly, I'm British with this voice, but if it all leads from America, does that increase tensions across global powers? If America's leading the charge and has this significant advancement in whatever their technology is, what does that look like geopolitically?
Well, yeah. So I think to analyze the geopolitical implications, you have to load in a variety of different assumptions that could be, go from maybe the most conservative to the most exotic, right? So the most conservative scenario is that, no nation has actually successfully reverse engineered this and has developed, what you would call like an asymmetric, um, strategically destabilizing capability, right? So if you assume that hasn't happened, and you're just narrowly assessing a scenario where geopolitics has to respond to the fact of being a common, baseline recognition by most populations in the world, then at least just on that one narrow, sort of scenario, I think it would be very potentially China would be in a good position to take advantage of that, right? So if you look at China's sort of strategic objectives and their sort of national rhetoric and their international sort of messaging, they have this vision of a common destiny for a shared future for humankind, and that they're trying to position themselves essentially as the voice for the global South. That through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Digital Silk Road, they're essentially articulating and then actually exporting and constructing a vision of a certain sort of techno-authoritarian, governance model, and they want to position themselves as sort of I'll butcher the Mandarin, but essentially the Tian Sha, essentially like the center power that the world, will essentially respect as the most legitimate state. And so if it was to come out that the U.S. or elements of the U.S. that they could credibly accuse of essentially betraying humanity, right, in the interest of securing for themselves sort of a narrow, technological and military advantage, and that they have withheld, illegitimately, facts that every human is essentially entitled to, by birthright on the nature of their existence in the cosmos, in service of kind of this, what they would call kind of the this techno-capitalist industrial, kind of feudal system. And they might actually have, they might score pretty strong propaganda points in the rest of the world and even potentially domestically. And so that could be quite destabilizing, and would have cascading geopolitical implications. Of course, I think the more exotic scenarios are ones where there is, quote unquote, as Carl Nell has said, a Cold War arms race to not just recover but actually exploit, reverse engineer, and maybe develop derived or inspired technologies from these technologies of unknown origin. And there, the space of analysis is extremely uncertain because it really relies on what exactly is the degree of success and how have those been applied. Is it in advanced aerospace platforms that can radically change how people think about sort of war planning and scenarios in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, like who actually has the tactical advantage, or how it might destabilize our strategic nuclear doctrine, right? Do we actually have a counterforce system that actually can render China's ICBMs, inert or moot in some scenarios? Does it change, other aspects of the strategic technology competition between U.S. and China, which are the two, main poles that are going to drive geopolitical risk in the next, 5-10 years? And that could be not just like military things, but are there actually like really, really sort of next generation, sort of economically relevant technologies that have been, inspired that could give a sort of a leap ahead advantage to one nation or the other, right? Could be better ways of extracting and refining sort of raw materials. It could be more efficient, and breakthrough sort of materials or next generation energy, room temperature superconducting, quantum computing, right? You can imagine all these things that potentially would destabilize the balance of sort of technological power, and not just military, but also the economic um, kind of race that is clearly underway. So that is, I think, very much front of mind. If you just read the statute, the statutory language that the Senate had put out, so I think the phraseology was like, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the federal government must broaden awareness of historical exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. So they seem to be motivated out of this. It could just be convenient justification, right? The sort of like the China's getting a jump on us is a very easy way to convince your peers to get along with a bill, right? Like China is like the one thing that's kind of a bipartisan topic. I think it's also no coincidence that Representative Mike Gallagher, who was the chair of the select committee on strategic competition with the CCP, his whole shtick as a PhD marine intelligence officer, good-looking congressman from the Midwest, sort of poised himself at the top of the select committee and basically made it his baby, and postured, and then transitioned to working as the head of defense for Palantir now, and is deep in the VC space. But Gallagher has gone on podcasts and has been very explicit in trying to broach this conversation into kind of what you call like flyover country, right? He's gone on the Pat McAfee show in particular twice, and he's explicitly talked about UAPs. And in his final appearance, he even brought up the different sort of canonical sorts of explanations. So he it may not just be ET, it could be crypto terrestrial, it could be they've been here longer than we have, they could be time travelers, right? So he, this serious congressman responsible for our China kind of competition strategy coming out of Congress, he's been very not so subtly whispered as a future presidential candidate in 2028. He is taking 30-40 minutes out of his schedule to do an interview explicitly on UAPs, where he just decides unprompted to bring up these different explanations that you hear on UFO Twitter spaces. So I find all of that kind of very, very curious, and that there clearly is a geopolitical dimension here. Carl Nell's statement obviously draws a thick line under that. So yeah, I mean, I analyze all sorts of conventional geopolitical scenarios professionally, right? Doing tabletop exercises for C-suites on, say, what would happen in a escalation over Taiwan or in the Philippines, like the Sierra Madre, or spillovers in the Middle East. And these are inherently like complex, uncertain. There are lots of basically sticking your finger in the air and trying to shade the probabilities. And that all that irreducible complexity and chaos in the global system would just be amplified by the reincorporation of this into sort of traditional risk assessment analysis. And I don't think that necessarily is an easy thing to do. I try to think about it, and then as soon as I do, you can tell I just kind of get lost in every branch.
It's complex. It's very complex. Ashton, did you have something to add to
that? We'll go to Dove first, and then yep.
Yeah, just listening. Every time I hear you talk, Matt, I just like add a bunch of inquiries to my line of thinking. But to my original question, I just wanted to ask, do you have anything that you wanted to comment on, or anything about like really interesting things that are kind of in the current, like within UFO Twitter, that people are talking about regarding the James Webb Telescope, February shootdowns? I did have some questions about EMPs as they relate to like Lou Elizondo and Ross Coulthart and some of that stuff. And then also the incidents of like these drone swarms that we've been talking about for a couple of years now, and how that might relate or like converge with your line of work. Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on any or all of those. I mean, just the last one in particular. I think it's important to understand that, and this is a good segue from the last conversation, like, we haven't fought a great power war, since the 40s. And the lesson that, we learned as a government, and I think every other government learned, is that um, strategic war winning or war deterrent capabilities are likely going to be directly downstream of breakthroughs or fundamental advances in understanding of theoretical physics. That was the lesson that was learned, very very harshly by the Japanese, and I don't think anyone forgot it. And so my baseline assumption is that every country of a certain power that has a certain academic and industrial and scientific and military capacity is going to have portions of that capacity devoted to fundamental physics research with the specific objective of developing breakthrough military intelligence capabilities. Like that should just be your baseline assumption. And the main objective of those sorts of those R&D activities, parking the whole UAP conversation aside, right, would be to develop things that you only use in special cases, or you only use in certain scenarios, or you're trying to send a signal to the adversary or whatever. So I think there is likely a mix of things going on when you see like the disruptions to Langley Air Force Base. And again, I haven't done like the full forensics dive on that particular case, but I think it would be a fair assumption that some of the things that are reported as UAPs are likely, foreign adversary systems trying to spoof, interrupt, surveil, or otherwise inject noise into our military workups, our intelligence, and counterintelligence systems, basically trying to mess with us and try to capture strategic advantage. And so that you should expect that to be happening in the just as a baseline. And then so you're trying to not just pick out noise in terms of flocks of birds or balloons, quote unquote, but actual advanced adversary systems that may actually be inspired by things that may have reverse engineered from our own advanced military systems, right? So like you look at the characteristic orb, right, that came in Dr. Kirkpatrick's briefing slides. You had orbs everywhere, like not so subtly as the sort of iconography and the symbology. And there was sort of the dominant reported morphology in his sort of distribution of the UAP reports. And they're like metallic orbs that sort of go between, I think it was like sub Mach to like Mach 1, Mach 2. So seemingly advanced, but not necessarily like tic tac advanced, not like some craft that sort of seems to be, doing, 10,000 Gs and going from 80,000 feet to sea level in a second, or essentially dematerializing or doing these like crazy anomalous maneuvers. And so I just think like how to assess that particular case with these other sorts of observations is it's going to be, I track them, but like I just think it's going to be extremely difficult for anyone in the open source to try to really discern what's going on with those cases. I think it's going to be it's very difficult for even folks that are tasked officially with, say, a counterintelligence mission to defend sensitive aerospace from really resolving in some cases what is actually happening here, right? Because I think some of the capabilities that might be being deployed would look pretty anomalous to observers that aren't read into some of those programs. And so that I think makes assessing these sorts of public reports as evidence of truly exotic, non-human derived technology, hard to discern. I think there are though cases that are clearly in that bucket of, say, like the Maelstrom case, Rendlesham Forest case. Obviously, there's long documented cases of things that are truly anomalous, that are not just like the slightly more advanced weird thing, but like something that is doing something very, very advanced and is actually disrupting our ICBMs in the silos at scale, and clearly using things that we don't understand how to do. So that's how I assess like that category. The James Webb thing, so that I think is very interesting. This is where even Dr. Kirkpatrick, sometimes he says things that I actually agree with, right? And so he was talking at the George Mason event, and I think he also said it in an interview. And he basically was saying is like, if you ask the question like, do aliens exist in the universe? It's like everyone has an opinion. It's like a fully legitimate question to ask. The Fermi paradox. What's the rate of star production? How complicated life can emerge? What are the conditions that would be suitable? The law of large numbers. It's a completely reasonable question. No astrobiologist is like gonna sneer at you. If you ask the question like, is there life in the galaxy? Kind of the same thing. If you ask, is there life that is like proximate to us in sort of our local stellar neighborhood? They go, oh well, now we would have seen it, yada yada. And so the James Webb Space Telescope is sort of situated kind of just in that margin where it's essentially trying to pull the Overton window of like scientific acceptability for asking that question like closer and closer to the Earth. Because if you ask the question like, is there life, on Earth? Advanced non-human intelligence on Earth. That's kind of for the traditional scientific community, kind of sneer worthy. But James Webb is sort of a potential bridge, right? And I think Dr. Kirkpatrick wasn't talking about James Webb in particular, but he was basically he enjoined the academic community to basically invert the question. I think he even said that explicitly, like, give me your most advanced, models, serious, rigorous, analysis of what would be the signatures of an advanced intelligence if it was here, so that I can then take those, peer-reviewed, detailed, mathematically derived models of what sorts of possible advanced propulsion systems would generate what detectable signatures. You give me a model, you make a prediction that you should see, say this, distortion in some local gravity, and I have a gravitometer and I can actually detect that, or you would see some other, infrared or you say, blue shift or whatever, in the EM spectrum. These are things that would be hypotheses you could derive from a mathematical model if you took it seriously, and you could give it to the intelligence community, and they could say, oh, I have lots of different sensors that can pick up these things, and I could actually test that hypothesis. So he actually, put that out there very explicitly, that he was enjoining the academic community to come to him with those hypotheses, develop those models, give him those potential signatures, and they would look in to see if they could collect that. I don't think that actually happened, but he did say that. And this is just a roundabout way to getting back to the James Webb, because this is, that was an official government representative, charged with this mission of, discerning what's going on here. And he was, enjoining that scientific and academic community, including the folks that are, their whole life mission is essentially to search for life in the universe. And that's why we build these billion-dollar telescopes, and these amazing feats of engineering to launch them into space, and many, many, many years and thousands of people trying to pour through the data. And I would just say, like, it's kind of a shame that no one took Kirkpatrick up on his offer. But James Webb, I think, could be an interesting bridge here. I listened to some of the folks in charge of those different sort of research teams, including the ones that are focused on like TRAPPIST-1 in particular. So TRAPPIST-1 is an M dwarf sort of planetary system. It's got about 7 planets that we've observed, and it's it sticks out like a sore thumb in terms of the candidates that could be suitable in terms of terrestrial planets that could have atmospheres. And so it's an intense object of study, because it's plausible. Like the next breakthrough in terms of astrobiology would be able to find a terrestrial planet, essentially an Earth-like rock-like planet. It's in a stable orbit, it's in a stable system. There's some issues with red dwarf flares, but they could plausibly, using the instruments that are on the infrared detection on James Webb, actually detect atmospheres, and then also importantly characterize the atmospheres. And characterization of exoplanetary atmospheres could potentially reveal both biosignatures as well as technosignatures. Right, biosignatures would be sort of anomalous levels of, say, oxygen or methane. Technosignature would be detection of, say CFCs, right? The things that we ban from refrigerators. These are products only of technological civilization. And so, like, the leaders of these research collaboratives that are having that get hundreds of hours on the James Webb Space Telescope just to zoom in on these particular planets in TRAPPIST-1, this is what they're looking for. Then they've said it explicitly. They're looking for atmospheres, and they want to characterize those atmospheres. And then if they can characterize those atmospheres, they want to see if there's any biosignatures or technosignatures. And so this conversation is very serious, and in the scientific discourse now is that we have an instrument that is doing observations, and it's plausible those observations could generate results that would be an indication of life, even advanced life, on another planetary system. And so that 5-10 years ago would have been kind of a bit of a fantasy, and like the hypothetical if everything works out with James Webb. But now that it's up and running, and they're going into these different cycles of observations, and they're starting to get some of the preliminary data, I think you're seeing a tone and tenor shift in, well, what if we do find a positive detection? What sort of conversation then does that trigger? I know there's been lots in the rumor mill, and folks sort of hearing from somebody who heard from somebody that they actually detected such a signature. I've heard similar rumors. I looked into like where we are in the current phase of observations, and it's plausible that we got what you would consider like a preliminary indication. But being scientists, these folks, especially with such a discovery, would likely want to have like, 5, 6 sigma confidence before they had a published result. And so it's possible that they have what they think is good evidence, but they want to wait. And this might be a bit in the weeds and super nerdy, but like one issue I think that community is confronted, and the lead author of this kind of roadmap for this sort of specific observations pointed to as a wrinkle in their original plan was the possibility of like stellar contamination. So when they do these observations, they kind of, essentially are trying to use the planet, like the star's light, essentially, as it goes through the atmosphere of the planet they're observing, to essentially use it as to take basically a spectrum of the molecules that are in that atmosphere. And it turns out that their assumptions on exactly how that would work weren't as sound as they thought. And so basically what that means is then you do more different kinds of observations, at least this is what they say. And that means there's going to be it's going to take more cycles, right? It's going to take several hundred more hours of observation to generate sufficiently high confidence, data to screen out that stellar contamination. So I know there's been lots of talk about there has been a detection, and it's plausible that something has been seen, and that sort of starts to filter out. But does that mean that we're going to get like a published paper and announcement anytime soon? I would sort of doubt it. But it could mean. But I think you don't necessarily even have to believe that to know that if you just take their current roadmap, they're kind of saying that. Again, science is not like deterministic, but the next year, 2 years, 3 years, they could be in a pretty solid position to publish a paper that definitively states the detection of a biosignature and even potentially a technosignature, if that's actually what's in that system. And so, if that's the case, right, like that would be a big deal. That would then be
Huge.
yes. And so that's also where I think was it Andre Carson was asked the question, he said no comment, right? Like
Hmm.
it's possible that congressmen have given me briefings about this, like, hey guys, just to like give you the heads up, right? Like we're not saying we found anything, but like we're now sufficiently confident in the basic models and our observations that like there's a chance we could. And we just want to like make sure that folks are prepped for that possibility. I
Right.
could see that happening.
What a time to be alive, Matthew. What a time to be alive. It was interesting. I was scrolling as I do across social media, and it's really seeing how quick a rumor can echo around social medias. And my little boy came running in earlier and showed me that they'd found lights on a planet, and it was on TikTok. So it really was quite amusing to
Nice.
me how quickly it could hit different medias. Science Bob, you've got your hand up. You got a question for
Hold on,
Matthew?
yeah, hold up. I wanted to jump in too. I
Oh,
wanted to
Is
oh,
the
ask,
host or co-host here?
yeah.
go.
So I wanted to ask about community, and I think one of the most interesting things that I found over the past year was that after the first skiff, there was basically the guy from News Nation and Matt Laszlo. And I wonder, to me, the real question I wanted to ask you is what's the best direction of the community? Because you mentioned Lester and UAP Caucus, and I know there's a lot of great resources that are set up, but upcoming in the future, what do you think, like, to hold Congress accountable? Because a lot of times I feel like Matt Laszlo is educating these people when he's asking them the questions. And then, they sort of go off and we don't know what happens. But I wonder, what do you think for the community? Because the community is hungry and how they can contribute to the UAP and UFO topic to and however way. What do you think the best direction for that is?
I mean, I would listen to Lester. I mean, that's his whole background, and he's I think on in the trenches doing that. I'm not a political activist, but I could give you my take, which is yeah, like in general, like being productive citizens in a democracy means like telling your elected representatives like what you care about and doing that in a polite, respectful, and informed fashion. And so I would avail yourself of every opportunity to do that, right? Like I was a congressional intern once, and I used to pick up the phone when constituents would call, and I had to take notes and then respond via emails. And so those would all get tracked and reported up to the congressman on what those constituents cared about. And if he would go to a town hall and he would be asked a question, he'd want to make sure he's prepared to respond, and not, especially in the age of cell phone video being recorded usually when answering a question like that is not something you'd want to be you'd want to flub. So I think it doesn't take a whole lot, actually. I think it's pretty sort of a high leverage move to actually participate in democracy. So I would encourage that. And so, yeah, I think all these different groups, it's like the more the merrier between the Soul Foundation. I think they have different objectives, right? Some more on political mobilization, activation, education, that sort of thing, which I think is just important to just like demonstrate like any other political topic. Like there's serious people that care about it, and politicians respond to that. It actually doesn't take a whole lot. But then I also think actually that's I mean easy-ish, but like there's at least a finite number of congressmen, right? Like you can go and meet with them all, right? And you'll quickly understand like who's persuadable, who's interested, who's not, right? I think the more challenging part is actually what the Soul Foundation is trying to do, which is on the broader kind of academic and professional kind of institutional conversion or at least conversation. Because I think those sorts of systems of scholarship and research are much more resistant, I think, on the margin. And so I think it's basically a miracle that Gary Nolan has set up Soul Foundation like fully within the auspices of Stanford, and has managed to essentially protect it from I'm sure there are folks looking to knife him in the back there. So yeah, I think that's obviously took a handful of individuals deciding they wanted to do something like that. I certainly would support all those efforts. But yeah, I'm not a political strategist. I've never worked on campaigns. I don't, I'm not an expert on, political communication. So take my thoughts for what they are.
Cool. Thanks. Science Bob, what's up, dude?
Hey, Matthew, it's really good to interact with you. After you started jumping on podcasts, I listened to every one of them. Your command of the depth and breadth of the subject, history, and your understanding of all the things that are going on, it's really quite amazing. And I thank you for coming out and doing all that, because it's very helpful. So, one thing the couple of things I want to comment on. I am absolutely incensed about basic science, fundamental science, physics being uh, uh, classified from birth. I oppose that more than anything you can imagine. But I can imagine one area of fundamental science that could be really disruptive. So I put something up in the nest. Imagine, and I'd like for you to discuss for not for long, but a few minutes, your view of the impact of the total disruption of the entire energy economy by suddenly discovering an inexpensive, essentially free way of supplying energy, and say enabling every nation on earth to build the equivalent of nuclear powered submarines. So the total disruption to all the energy economy would be a major outcome. It's just let us have your comment on that, please.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually, as a result of me kind of coming out and saying, more explicit, you know, things on the subject, folks in other completely, normal domains have sort of reached out to me, in DMs, and actually say like, actually, I've been following this issue for a while. Like, I would love to chat with you. And some folks from, that are like serious economists, folks that have worked for the Treasury Department, very close with the Federal Reserve, folks that think about economic and monetary policy on sort of a macro scale. It's quasi thought experiment that may not be such a thought experiment for in the next few years, of like how would policymakers, right? Usually that's the thing, is like how would if you're the Fed, if you're the Treasury Secretary, if you're similar officials, like how would you, like, just to first order, if such a technology was going to be released, right? Just assume that's the scenario you're modeling, and it unleashes essentially a massive, almost like one-time productivity positive shock, right? Essentially now, the cost of production in many cases is rendered, mostly for whatever the labor cost is, or the skills, the professional, labor that's required. Essentially, the cost of capital goes way down, and you could see a massive acceleration of growth. It almost could be a similar exogenous shock to the factors of production that you would get from, say, like an emergence of like true AGI, right? So the similar sorts of modeling that maybe you could apply in terms of its economic effects. Ironically, I think an energy only technology would actually probably be easier to incorporate into the economy because it would be sort of sector specific in terms of its disruption, right? The oil and gas sector, natural gas. So there would be clear geopolitical effects, right? Like the major commodity producers, OPEC plus, would be hosed. A large swath of U.S. LNG and oil industry would be severely hit. But I think that would be, you could probably adjust over time to that, and I think would obviously be quite positive for humanity. um, I I think that policymakers, I don't think they had seriously to reckon with that. And I also don't think like the nature of it's a big step to go from physics to engineering, right? In that sense, and obviously people harangue some poor government decision making on why we haven't built as much nuclear as we maybe should have or could have. Like we have super clean, relatively, right, in terms of the actual footprint of nuclear waste, and we could have probably done more crash programs on nuclear fusion decades ago if it weren't for the broader stigma. And those promise essentially. There's lots of research now in inertial confined fusion reactors. There's small modular nuclear reactors. There's all sorts of like current roadmaps where we could be generating like pretty clean and high sort of energy return on energy invested energy sources. It's a political decision that we're not. And I do think though that going from a basic physics discovery to like engineered energy distribution is a different problem. Like if you say had some new physics that would allow you to essentially extract energy, say from the vacuum, right? If that's what this is, constructing devices that take advantage of that. I mean, it would be a function of, can this device be essentially mass produced at scale and distributed sufficiently to essentially become a in situ source of energy for almost any device anywhere, right? Like you could have it power your iPhone, you could have it power your car, you could have it power your house, right? Sort of a scale invariant source of energy, right? Is that how it can be engineered, or does it really require large contraptions, large engineering? It's got some safety issues. It needs to be highly regulated. It still needs to be connected to the grid, et cetera, et cetera. So like I can imagine scenarios, in both where we have breakthrough physics. There's a new source of energy that we can extract, from the degrees of freedom that are available to us in the physical universe, and it's an engineering problem. And the question is, does our engineering allow us to like radically change the structure of energy production distribution in our society? And that would have pretty dramatic effects on the whole way we structure our lives and perform work and industrial processes. Or would it basically just be like there's disruptions to some nodes in that system, but overall basically everything else kind of chugs along just much more cheaply? So yeah, I mean that's maybe my nerdy engineering answer to that.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
But there's other things like that. So the energy thing is one, but there's obviously propulsion, but there's also potentially other more like I talked about this earlier, like ways of refining materials, constructing more advanced metamaterials, actually maybe getting a room temperature superconductor. These things would be disruptive in their own right. And I think regardless of UAPs, I think we're entering an era where we're going to see accelerating disruption from technological progress, regardless. So yeah, I think ironically, like this conversation that you see happening in like the AI space, which sometimes gets a bit full of itself in terms of this echelon of the superintelligence emerging out of OpenAI's basement, and triggering kind of these apocalyptic visions on one hand, but also like a worry that there'll be pretty significant industrial, economic, and social disruptions, and even geopolitical disruptions as a result. Right, these things are all kind of converging in their kind of overall kind of narrative arc. But in the AI world, it's considered kind of within fully the Overton window for policymakers to have working groups and stand up, big deliberative bodies and try to think about risk management and economic policies and sort of redistributive policies. But there's no serious discussion at all, really, I think, officially on the UAP side of this. But I think they're quite similar in the structure of the implication.
Yeah, just wanted to comment that the machine learning based on tons of data from physics simulations. I personally worked on doing neural network simulations based on machine learning of Schrodinger's wave equation. And I was asked by Ned Allen, who's chief scientist of Lockheed, to tell you where their mind is, to apply that to the rejiggering of the chemical composition of fuel in jet aircraft, so that its heat capacity could be greatly increased. So because they dump the heat from the airplane's electronics into the fuel. So if you greatly increase the heat capacity, it's a major change to their engineering for airplanes. So I was going, just that one thing let me know that the moment we can do, say, Navier-Stokes and quantum mechanics and all sorts of other stuff on that are now nearly impossible simulations, but we can do propagation in time of all these really wild, crazy, lovely physics things easily on a neural network based computer. The world is really going to change.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some pretty radical changes. Whether it's officially from from technologies of unknown origin or it just is, you know, our human inspiration. I think we are on a trajectory the next 5 or 10 years to start doing some pretty crazy stuff. The convergence of these different technical paradigms, kind of mutually reinforcing each other, um, could be quite disruptive. On that one point though, like actually, I was just noticing, and I would draw folks to follow this gentleman. He's a distinguished senior leader in the U.S. government for many decades, named Harold Malmgren, and I've had the privilege to speak with him at some length about his storied career. He, was a senior advisor to multiple presidents, was responsible early in his career for helping the government kind of navigate through the Cuban Missile Crisis and keep Curtis LeMay at bay from dropping nukes on the Soviets on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, and since was sort of baptism by fire, introduced to some of the more sensitive aspects of U.S. government's programs, including our initial efforts at anti-ballistic missile defense, and then became a sort of a bête noire to Kissinger over the years, and sort of became one of the more well-respected international consultants, diplomats, economists, super just polymath. But he has tweeted out pretty explicitly now, aspects of his professional career that um, put him in contact with the sort of the with the UFO UAP storyline throughout the 20th century that he was pretty close to, and he's now kind of becoming I think the he's not censored anymore, right? He's getting towards the end of his life. I think he is very wants to sort of see his legacy carry on, and he is not holding back. And I think he just said today, essentially, that it's his understanding that we have what would amount to like very advanced space propulsion systems, getting to the moon and back in a matter of days. And so that's interesting for someone like him to say. And he has said in other forums publicly now that he had a private conversation with the CIA Deputy Director of Operations, kind of the chief spook, Richard Bissell, in his office, where he was told of the existence of off-world technologies, or I think it was other-world technologies. And he also related an anecdote when he was sent actually out to Los Alamos in the early 1960s, I think 1963, to help lead the cost design build for the anti-ballistic missile defense system, which at that time relied on essentially nukes to blow up other nukes when they were coming in. And he met with, ironically, the gentleman who became Jeff Bezos's grandfather, a guy named Guys, who was the director of the Western Division for the Atomic Energy Commission, including overseeing all the national labs, Los Alamos, Sandia, etc. And he met with him, and Guys basically told him of their reverse engineering retrieval activities for UAPs. And so this is a gentleman, Harry Malmgren, who does not mess around. Like, this guy has been probably in more senior leadership discussions for more presidents than like any living person. And here he is saying explicitly, he's had multiple interactions over the course of his life with very senior national security officials and technical officials that clued him into the reality of these programs and the existence of these materials. And now he's basically coming out and saying that we have the capabilities to get to the moon and back in a matter of days. So make of that what you will.
So I been following Malcolm for a long time, waiting on him to open his door if he ever would. I briefed him and Lowell Woods and Bran Farron about Star Wars way back way back when I was young. Anyway, I've done enough. Let somebody else ask a question.
Some awesome questions, though, Bob. Some awesome questions. Missile, you got a question for Matthew?
Hey, Matt. Nice to have you. Thanks for joining us. So, on the topic of disclosure battle lines, the conversation gets had a lot about the difference between philosophical and/or geopolitical motives within the program intelligentsia versus sort of like white collar considerations within the private sector. Um, do you see the for and against battle lines as sort of zigzagging and jogging into those boundaries such that there are both for and against parties on both sides of the public private divide? And what does that alliance structure look like to get to a favorable result for whether it's a UAPDA V3 or some future, activity? What do you see that alliance looking like? How do you get there? How do you squelch, that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest obstacle is to reckon with the political economy issue here, right? So I my operating assumption, I'd say it's not 100% confidence, but my operating assumption is that, and this is like basically making a very abridged sort of crude summary of 80 years of what I think was happening here, is that this was effectively a government program, right? Stood up under the auspices of Manhattan Project, you know, kind of the Vannevar Bush era Oppenheimer crew. This was those were extremely competent technocrats. These folks knew how to, run a very tight ship. They were, very like motivated, and I think also aligned with sort of, the national ethos and the principles of constitutional government and kind of the oversight mechanisms of Congress. And that even if you had needed to, for the interests of secrecy, keep it extremely well protected, I think it was still aligned with and sort of, accountable to the systems of government that birthed it. I suspect, and I think this is now pretty much strongly hinted at by folks like Elizondo, is that that system both kind of delaminated from the mechanisms of accountability, and also I think ethically decayed in its orientation towards national purposes. Maybe parts of it did, right, or maybe it wasn't as like a unitary entity over certain periods of time. And if you correlate that with the general arc of how the defense industrial base and kind of the global system of international financial capitalism evolved, starting in the 70s into the 80s, everything kind of became hyper financialized. The rise of private equity, the rise of international capital conglomerates, the power in offshore money centers held by very opaque corporate structures, and essentially rearranging systems of corporate ownership, and with an objective to accrue as much power and control over advanced technology and resources as humanly possible. And so that was the lesson. That's really what we've been hypercharged in this era of sort of technology driven globalization in the past 30, 40 years. And so I think I take that as like the basic political economy background sort of predicate for trying to assess, well, what is the sort of institutional status and the bureaucratic status of these legacy programs, to understand what exactly is the political dynamic that you're pointing to. What are these battle lines exactly, right? What are the, like, who's actually on what side, and what are their interests, what are the motivations, what are the capabilities? And this is just the all too human, right, answer to that question, let alone like what are the interests and motivations and capabilities of these other actors that are non-human, that we also have to sort of model in here. But I'll park that one aside. And I think a fair conclusion that I draw, though, is that it isn't necessarily like Lockheed as a corporation on one side and the government on one side and Congress on one side. I think it's a little bit more complicated, and I think there are legitimate institutional structures that have been set up inside the government. I think even these have been, like, the National Reconnaissance Office was secret for many years, right? And then we acknowledge it. It's like, oh yeah, we have an entire secret office here that is very large, and people in there never admitted they worked for that secret office, so that we did, right? So you could imagine there are similar offices like that that are, maybe dedicated to this particular portfolio. And they're just as legitimate as the NRO was, before it became, an acknowledged, government bureaucracy. And so I think you might have things like that, but then you might also have, other things in what you might call purely private sector hands, right? Folks that maybe only have a dashed line of accountability to someone in government somehow, somewhere, and maybe that's even tenuous or non-existent. And that is a much more difficult challenge for, I think, folks in the Senate to get their arms around. And I think, the reason why the eminent domain provision was so contentious is because that was a strong signal. Like, there was a signal that was being sent. It's like, the government has sort of almost a inherent right of eminent domain, right? But yet they decided to write this very specific clause of this legislation and, didn't change it in their second go around. Like, they were very clear. We want to send a signal. We want this group to take possession and make disposition decisions on any technologies of unknown origin in anyone's hands, right? Regardless, right? So that was a pretty definitive statement that they suspect, and they, want to send a signal to folks on maybe this this side of the fence there, that the status quo, where maybe the accountability and the power dynamic is gotten out of control. It's delaminated from systems of democratic oversight. And yeah, there's now, I think that is the battle line. That's how I read it. And I think, you're sort of, it's like dark matter. You're trying to sort of suss out what are the contours of that fight, and who has the relative advantage at different points via these legislative developments with UAPDA.
Or that they
So,
like the UFO topic could be used as a bigger pawn in all of this. Like, that sucks.
well, I mean, I also, I do not know what's in, say, Senator Gillibrand's mind, right? But I think, if you just look at what her priority has been in her public statements, it's very clear that her priority has been Pentagon being responsive to her, that she feels like these programs, these activities need to be reported to them. They need to be made aware. There needs to be the formal briefings. There needs to be a sense that we are Congress. We're an equal branch of government. We have a constitutional right to understand what you're doing, and you have to come and make us fully briefed and establish, reestablish those mechanisms of accountability and oversight. That is her priority. I do not detect explicitly, or even implicitly, a disclosure orientation. I think she co-sponsored the UPDA, but as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of two halves of the UPDA. There's the disclosure part, and then there's the accountability part. And I think, I don't know, I think the accountability part is probably what folks in Congress really want first. And then I think it's more of a, I don't know where they stand in terms of the disclosure part, right? Where they draw that line, right? I mean,
Well,
people in
I was
power.
going to ask you about the difference between the national security implications of talking about the crash retrieval programs, and it seems like a lot of other whistleblowers, even Lou Elizondo, is more comfortable with David Grush talking about non-human intelligence. Do you see a difference between their ability and like Lou Elizondo also talks about toting the line, that he's now able to talk about Roswell and now able to talk about some of this stuff. But a lot of people talk about the existence of non-human intelligence, and it feels a lot more comfortable in talking about, they're like, oh, I can't comment on national security issues of crash retrieval programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think a very rational approach to take, right? As I said, I don't think that there is a security classification guide that exists that says, you know, this non-human intelligence, the existence of this non-human intelligence, is classified government information. It could be classified government information if it's they have a intelligence source and method from which they derive that information, right? As you know, if the source of the information is classified, then the fact that's derived from that source can be classified. But there's ways of terrorlining that, right? You can release the information that the fact of NHI, that proposition, isn't classified. It's just, well, how do we know that, right? The how you know that is what's classified, right? Did we get that from in a secret facility? Did we get that from a secret satellite, from a secret intelligence source, right? Those are the things that are classified. And so crash retrievals, right? Those are government activities, right? That are conducted by our secret military and intelligence assets. And they're, may even be, using very secret compartmented programs, say to go into other countries or get things under the water or get things in space. And those are leveraging very sensitive national assets, very sensitive government programs, things that are very perishable, very fragile. Those are inherently legitimate sources and methods to protect for the U.S. government. And so I would expect folks like David Grush would be very wary of crossing that line and exposing the existence of a crash retrieval program that likely overlaps with and maybe even be identical with things like the foreign technology program and associated things that are compartmented that Carl Nell has had some experience with in his career. So this is where I think folks that come from that security background see this very clearly, very explicitly, like these are like oil and water, right, sorts of things, right? They've been put into the same bottle and mixed up, and they keep mixing the bottle up to try to make sure you can't separate out the oil from the water. But I think it's very clear like what's oil and what's water here. And you just have to have the political process play out to be able to separate those two things out. And then there's a separate question of, okay, there's the non-human intelligence fact of issue that's just not government information, so that shouldn't be withheld. But then it might be more of a sticky issue in terms of, well, how do you know that, right? Because if the government just says, oh, there's non-human intelligence, everyone's gonna be like, okay, prove it, right? Like, show me how you know that, right? Like, I don't believe anything the government says. Like, this is a big psyop. Like, they're just trying to, do whatever. They want more money. Like, this would be the standard response, right? It'd be like the government's lost its mind or whatever, right? And so the government would have to bring something out to prove the statement, right? Other than just like the president stating this as a fact from the Oval Office. There would be clamors, like it would be, the political pressure to prove it would be so strong, right? The question is, how do you prove that, right? How do you prove that statement sufficiently to, that would have to be part of your plan. And then the question would be, well, then what are you willing to sacrifice in terms of the hard material assets you have, your knowledge of the function of these technologies, if you have, anything to disclose? Do you actually show an example of the technologies or biological materials, right? Like that is not something that would be like that, which is definitely, like legitimately compartment, right? Like that's not something that would be an easy decision to make. And so this is why I do think they're kind of conjoined decisions, and it's not just an easy thing for the government to say. Like, I have some sympathy for the folks in the White House to be like, it's not just the matter of putting Biden out there and saying, yeah, NHI is real. Yeah, this has been a cover up. Yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, like we're gonna set up a formal process of accountability now, but we're gonna be straight with you, right? Like people are gonna want to know, like, show me the beef, right? And the question is, how do you show people the beef, enough of the beef, without disclosing to your adversaries, what you do or don't know, right? And not being accused of deception. And so this thing is like, it's a layer cake of both corporate malfeasance, decades of these sorts of problems that have to be sort of restitched together, as well as like the inherent political issue of like, well, who wants this to blow up in their face while they're in office? And the answer is nobody. So that's like, I don't know, I don't have a good answer for you there. And so, yeah, I mean, this is why I'm very surprised. Like, if you asked me, like, naively, right, like if this was my baseline assumption, like what would I expect for disclosure? I'd be like, I would never have thought we would ever have gotten this far, right? I've never would have thought like any of this would have come out, right?
But end game, what would you say disclosure is for you? Like, what do you think it is?
Well, this is where, like, my personal, this is where I go back to more of like the nerdy physics and philosophy thing, right? Like, I think even if you showed people a craft or whatever, right, that's not the ultimate answer, right? It's, well, who made it? Why are they here? Like, how do they make it? How do they get here? What are they here for? And that's not like a simple question of just, oh yeah, like we knocked on the hole and it's got some special properties. It's like, oh, there's some knowledge of the basic structure of physical reality that is far beyond what we currently have, and there's maybe an aspect of reality that we have currently not necessarily incorporated into a physicalist worldview that we don't really have good kind of conceptual vocabulary for. So for me, disclosure is actually like just trying to push us along in terms of our understanding of the nature of reality, right? Understand the nature of physics, understand the nature of consciousness, understand the nature of intelligence. And so disclosure to me is like, okay, well, do you have any better clues than we have in the public domain as to, like, maybe not the answer to those ultimate questions, but at least, push us further along? Like, do we have actually, can we get a bit further understanding of physics? Can we get a bit further in our understanding of the nature of reality? Can we, like, advance the human, kind of mental model of its place in the universe with other intelligence a little bit further? Like, that to me, it's not like not a binary. It's just, okay, the trajectory of human civilization has been one of, radically revising our sense of our place in the universe via our, radical transformation of our fundamental physics and scientific models, right? And so I think that to me would be what disclosure means for me, is like, oh yeah, NHI, okay, like I've pretty much already accepted that NHI, obviously exists in the universe and very likely exists here. Okay, but that's just like, I don't know. People think that is a huge deal. From my perspective, like I'm sort of over that, right? I'm like, okay, well, what is the structure of the dynamic here between different intelligences, and what is the implication in terms of knowledge that represents about the nature of the universe? That to me is that's the ball game, right? Like I don't really, they're flying around here, they have particular shapes or whatever, right? They can, read people's minds, like, okay, good, right? I care, but I don't really care, right? Like I care about like what does that tell me in terms of these fundamental questions?
The next
That's what I
layer,
want.
yeah.
I know that's probably that's maybe my super nerdy take on that question. Most people would probably just be like, oh well, it's just come clean, just say, we're not alone, and that's it. But I don't think that's
You're
really.
amongst UFO nerds. No worries. UFO intros. You got your hand up. What's up, dude?
Yeah, Matthew, thanks for doing this interview. You said something in a podcast. I honestly can't remember the name of it, but I thought it was really interesting. You said the millionaires are out of the loop. The billionaires, they know and they want to know more. And so I was just curious, like, what is the discrepancy there? What is the difference between the billionaires and the millionaires, where one doesn't even know it exists and the other wants to know more? Thank you.
I think that might be a slight misphrasing, but I think I know what you're pointing at in terms of I'm aware that there are folks inside kind of what you would call like the elite venture capital world, right? Folks with many millions of dollars and or up to billions of dollars that are very interested in the subject for reasons you would expect those people to be interested in, right? I think it's they want to try to get the advantage, right? These guys are hyper competitive. They're always looking for the edge. And I think at least my diagnosis of some of this, and elaborating on at least my view of the kind of the political economy of these legacy programs, is that the political economy of U.S. advanced technology and tech and capital has changed pretty dramatically in the last 20 years. The position of Lockheed relative to, say, like the defense primes in DC relative to, say, Silicon Valley has shifted. There are now like enormous pools of capital and individuals that see themselves as astride these quasi-sovereign entities, right? And or in positions to wield more subtle but extreme influence in terms of the allocation of capital and investment in strategic technology. And for these people to feel that they've been cut out of the loop of such a thing is just an affront to their sense of power in the world. And so it is their prerogative not to achieve disclosure, and it's not even really to get some technological advantage. I mean, that's probably like a more of like a pipe dream, whatever. It's really just to kind of assuage their egos that that they're not special like they thought they were, and that there's systems of knowledge that they've been excluded from, and they want in. Right? It's just the all too human sense that there's always a cool kids club and they want to be invited to it, and that's basically the status dynamic. If you talk to folks in leading venture capital, or these sorts of masters of the universe hedge fund types, is that the game is really just a status hierarchy, and it's always who's got the biggest yacht and the art collection in some tax shelter, et cetera, et cetera. And they always want to know that they always want to feel like they know more than anybody else, and that they actually have this privileged view of what's actually going on in the world. And I think for some of those folks to realize that there's this huge area that has just been completely out of their view. It's some of them still reject it, but others are like, wait a second, like this is this really irritates me, and I'm going to then leverage my existing influence and capital to try to pry my way in. And so yeah, I've heard various names. Some folks that people might recognize, other folks probably people wouldn't. That have been sniffing around this for a few years, and these people are also political donors, right? These people have political action committees. These people get folks like Senator Gillibrand of New York elected. So I wouldn't underplay the role that some of this sort of ego butthurt by the billionaire class that's been cut out from this subject,
Wow.
and the relative power dynamic, shifting away from the defense primes to these,
That's a
deep tech.
fascinating answer. Thank you. So, I mean, really, for the average person, this is a strong signal that this is being taken seriously, because at least billionaires are, consider this an affront to their ego because they're not read in to this information that's now being taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, this has just been happening, and I think I've described this as like two different processes of like, high trust percolation through networks of individuals, one on one, and information is shared, you know, credibly, and then the broader social diffusion, right, where it's still sort of snickered and sneered at, or sort of kind of looked at curiously as a sort of something on the feed, and usually distorted by a variety of different, maybe intentional and unintentional psychological manipulation with whatever kind of exaggerated thing that would grab people's attention.
I
Yeah,
wonder if
unfortunately, yeah.
That's
like
awesome.
blockchain,
We've come a long way. Thank you.
wonder if like blockchain, AI, UAP research is sort of coming to a front.
Could you elaborate?
Well, yeah, I know you've looked at some of the cryptocurrency stuff, maybe some of the blockchain and then AI development. I know UAP research may be part. I don't know. Like, could other sort of things that are on the forefront be used for UFO research or UAP research in terms of AI or blockchain technology?
I don't have a direct answer to that, but you reminded me though of a very curious conversation I had in the green room backstage at the Bitcoin conference in 2022, where I was about to go on stage. I think it was just before or just after Eric Weinstein was going to go on and talk with Avi Loeb, and so I was in the backstage talking with Eric and Avi for about a good half an hour. And the Eric conversation, as you can imagine, was just like completely autistic in fundamental physics, just going off on that particular trajectory. And then Avi was very much interested in basically just trying to get a bunch of crypto billionaires to like fund his research. And he actually got one. He got although it wasn't a
Love
Bitcoin
that.
guy, it was this Cardano guy who actually got him. He went on like that expedition with him to recover some of those like spheroids or whatever on the bottom of the ocean. So I think the connection thus far has basically just been money, right? Like which is I think important, right? Because there's kind of this there's to that same dynamic I was pointing out with like venture capital. There's more like institutional capital, but there actually are very wealthy folks now in that have become wealthy in a very sort of non-traditional fashion, and they weren't acculturated into the sort of systems of traditional kind of elite group identity and kind of social mores that like traditional rich people get acculturated into. If you go to Wharton, become a hedge fund manager, or you IPO your startup and you get a bunch of money and Goldman Sachs helped you do it, right? Everyone kind of gets rich along a certain number of
Or just someone
same.
like Bob Bigelow, like that has
Yeah,
transitioned from
well,
aerospace to like consciousness studies or something like that.
exactly. Yeah, it takes a kind of a really heterodox, idiosyncratic person who got wealthy entirely kind of on their own channel, who has who has no fucks to give basically, and doesn't owe anybody anything. And there's a lot of folks like that, kind of they're on the younger side, and the kind of the who got a lot of who bought Bitcoin at whatever $10. And I think folks like Avi was there to kind of like shake some of those pockets loose. And even Eric, his whole pitch on that stage to the Bitcoin audience was basically, "Hey guys, like whatever, like you won the lottery. Like what are you gonna do with it now, right? Like you've got some cash, like you're just gonna hoard it, right? Like you should fund, breakthrough physics, right? Like the current institution of academia is sort of stuck in a rut. It's been captured by what he sees as this dead end and string theory. There may even be like an actual conspiracy to classify fundamental physics research, and that if we're gonna like break through, we need to have folks that are outside sort of the institutional system, pony up some capital to actually fund some of these initiatives. And I don't know how successful that has been, but yeah, that would be how I would stitch those two things together. I think on the AI side, there are and this is the broader, dynamic I actually write about in my normal work, which is, from everything from space imaging, open source intelligence, signals intelligence, cyber, there are some leading edge capabilities in the private sector that are rivaling, if not exceeding, what the federal government has. I think even just today, it was announced that the Navy basically signed a contract with a company for their space imaging, because it's just really good, right? There's certain, that's a unique capabilities the federal government has invested in, but there's lots of capabilities the private sector has now that the government doesn't have, and they just have to buy it, right? Like everybody else. And so, when it comes to synthesizing and integrating different sensor information from space observations to different sorts of sensor platforms that could be, self-sponsored. I know the Galileo Initiative is pushing this. I think the era of citizen science or even private funded science, could actually be quite effective. I don't know, this is a bit of a hot take, but you could see us potentially swinging back towards maybe the 18th century style of science. The 20th century was, of course, hyper dominated by state directed research and development, obviously directly aligned with usually national security institutions and their prerogatives, and any breakthroughs would quickly get sucked behind the curtain. But that might not be something that's such an easy thing to keep going now. That you have private space constellations, really high fidelity imaging and different sort of multispectral sensors. And now folks that are motivated to look, right? And yeah, that I think is happening. I think actually, Harold Malmgren's daughter, Pippa Malmgren, she's also a polymath like her father, was a senior official in the Bush administration, actually on the economic side. She was a currency trader, but now she's like a big investor, geopolitical strategist, and she's like really deep into this sort of emerging space economy, and really has a finger on the pulse of some of these really advanced technologies that are coming out of private sector innovation, and that are potentially rivaling what the government has, and potentially could break this monopoly. And that just not be another way disclosure happens, right? It doesn't come from the government. It comes from just an accumulation of evidence that's gathered and analyzed by private sector individuals. So yeah, this could come in many different ways, and of course, the ability to sift and assess large volumes of that sort of information is going to be accelerated by AI, and I think that will broaden the sort of competitive field.
Thanks, Matt. I'm conscious of time, so I think maybe for about 10, 15 more minutes, if that's cool with you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Who was next? Dun,
It was
dun, dun.
Neanderthal was
It
next, and
sure
then
was.
Dove, and then intros.
Let's go.
Hey, Matt. Great space, you guys. Apologies if somebody's already brought this up. I've been jumping in and out. But I was kind of wondering what you think about the possibility of, say, Russia or China unveiling some either technology they have or disclosure happening from another country, and, whether or not you would think that, maybe the geopolitical situation, how it's deteriorating, would affect maybe somebody bringing out some of this technology because it has a less collateral damage type profile than, say, nuclear weapon or something like that. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I think I addressed some of this, but there's a aspect I didn't really touch on that relates to that question. And it's specific to, obviously I think I'm relatively confident that the US government has had a program, and that the Russians have had a program, and that the Chinese have also, maybe more recently stood up a program related to this, or what we would call a program. The structure might be very different, but I think that's I sort of take Carl Nell's I put a good weight on what Carl Nell said about there being a sub-Rosa Cold War here. So then the nature in terms of the R&D programs, though, right? Because you can imagine there's a crash retrieval, whatever, similar sorts of activities to understand the phenomenon. And there's the actual military application of that. And those things, to be strategically relevant, would have to be, somehow inserted into the traditional military R&D, platform development, system in those respective military bureaucracies. And, if you actually look at China's military bureaucracy, it's gone through quite a number of convulsions in the past 10 years as as Xi Jinping has restructured the military, trying to aggressively modernize it, has purged it pretty significantly, including the rocket forces, which oversee the nuclear and strategic forces. And it would probably be that branch that is likely where, whatever aspects of their program reside somewhere. And he's systematically purged almost every key leader in that part of the military. Yeah, so that is, I would expect that, the way that China would conduct their legacy program, if there's a version of it, would be very different than ours. I could paint a scenario here where, like, imagine that there was, so this might be a bit of a history lesson. So back in the 70s, I think even John Ramirez has talked about this, that the U.S. and China were actually quite close in terms of our intelligence partnership. We both had an interest in setting up joint monitoring stations. To check out the Russians. The Sino-Soviet split was real, and we took advantage of that. And the CIA and the NSA, jointly operated and trained, with the PRC, military forces and intelligence. We set up signals intelligence collection systems, and he's come out and said this publicly now. So, and it was actually President Biden that sealed the deal for that with Deng Xiaoping, ironically. So you can imagine, though, that, like, okay, layer in that with the fact that maybe there actually was something like whatever Office of Global Access sort of retrieval programs, and maybe an aspect of this intelligence partnership was we essentially had a franchise of the legacy program with the Chinese intelligence and military systems that effectively we trained, and like the job of the intelligence community is to, like, own those people, right? They work for us, not China anymore, right? At that point. And China, of course, China's military was, classically corrupt, right? To be promoted, you basically had to bribe the next person up. So pretty easy pickings to do that. And I can imagine, though, like, that being a thing that maybe Xi Jinping found out about, right? Maybe there actually was aspects of his own military apparatus that were running these legacy programs that weren't fundamentally controlled by him, and these purges, maybe were motivated by other things, but could have had a more a motivation amplified by this recognition. And so, what he might then do once he's gotten control of his own legacy program, you can imagine, like, we're struggling with our own way of getting control over a rogue program, but we don't exist in a totalitarian state where we can just purge and throw everyone into the Gulag or just assassinate them, right? Like, we have to do things like try to struggle to pass the UAPDA. We have to, like, threaten, cajole, and induce, and have whistleblowers, and play out this kind of very dragged out process to kind of achieve accountability, right? Because we just can't just go and arrest these people and throw them into jail if they're not listening to the Senate or whatever. In China's system, yes, that's exactly what you can do. And so if he got control of this program via that sort of set of systematic purges, then he might say, okay, well, this is now a priority, and I'm going to throw 10,000, 50,000 people at it. And China could do that, right? So they could have gone from having really not much progress and not doing a whole lot, and kind of being a sleepy backwater, maybe even a legacy arm of our program, to now being essentially fully run and captured by China in the official bureaucratic control system, but now is being like it's being surged with resources. And I think I even talked about this in the other podcast, that, like, that surge of resources might become apparent to our traditional intelligence system that's monitoring Chinese R&D efforts as a matter of course, and tracking their scientists and tracking their different research institutes and all their different R&D activities. And sort of something like this would sort of stand out potentially if their OPSEC wasn't perfect. And so that would trigger a broader awareness within the government of something that China was working on that was potentially a strategic breakthrough. And this then comes back into the language you see coming out of the Senate, which is, like, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, et cetera. And so this does play into then the geopolitical kind of dynamic between U.S. and China. And I go back to this, like, there's tons of war games. Some have been classified, but I think even the classified war games don't take into account, the stuff that's truly behind the curtain, right? And this makes gaming out any sort of U.S.-China competition or conflict scenario, like, extremely difficult, because you don't really know, like, when the chips are down, like, who's got what up their sleeve and how that will actually have a tactical effect. And I think there actually is a debate playing out in the United States, and this is now public, you can read some of the statements from the Space Force, the Air Force. There has been a debate over the last several years about whether we should declassify, at least partially, some of our space capabilities in order to send a deterrent signal to China. And we were about to, I think, declassify and even do a demonstration of one of those capabilities. And I think we suspended at the last minute, and COVID may have played a role in that. But there's a quote from, I think, is the Space Force commander, who basically said, like, deterrence doesn't happen in the black, it happens in the white. Like, in order to deter somebody, you actually have to show them that you've got something that, like, that they don't have that actually changes their decision making. And so, this is this constant kind of equities assessment of, is it more valuable to keep it entirely secret, so that if we actually want to, have it sure there's no countermeasure for it, we can use it in a conflict scenario. But essentially that's a very high risk, because you're only holding it for a scenario where you're actually fighting. Or do you try to hint to the adversary you actually have something that they should recalibrate their plans and strategies? Maybe Xi Jinping's confidence in a successful Taiwan invasion would be materially diminished if he felt that there was something that we could deploy that would make the chance of that invasion be less successful. And so this is a very complicated game. This is why this disclosure conversation is not just like in the quote UAP community, right? These are inextricably linked to the most high stakes geopolitical decisions and deliberations happening across the spectrum in the military and intelligence community. And there's no easy answer, I think, for those different parts of the bureaucracy that themselves don't necessarily even know, like, what's behind the iron, like the green door, right? Like, there are many cases of the over compartmentalization of these capabilities that sometimes even the war planners for certain scenarios don't get told, right? And so it's kind of a mess, would be my takeaway, that there's no master plan with all these things in a big game board, and they all just roll out. But yeah, I think this is something I think about increasingly as critical to how we play through the next 5 or 10 years with China, and avoid a war, right? How does that, that should be a primary objective, right? And to the extent that a collateral benefit of being more transparent on the OP question could diffuse the possibility of that sort of confrontation, I think that should be a priority. Sorry, that was another rambling session.
No, it was so really, really articulate. Wow. You've given me a lot to mull over, Matthew, that's for sure. Dove, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, just with your, multispectral awareness of all these things with your work and like your personal interest in UFOs historically and, understanding of ufology and disclosure. Like, I was going to ask you, does this get
Is anyone speaking right now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Who is that? Was that Kimball? Yeah, Dove's just speaking. I don't know if you...
I think Dove was next.
Yeah, Dove's already spoke. I don't know if you're hearing properly. Maybe drop down and come back up. Carry on, Dove.
I was just gonna say, does that get like personally heavy for you as far as like, you with your family and like that type of stuff? But I also wanted to ask, I usually ask everybody about Mellon's signal exchange and the release of that, because I felt like that was such an interesting piece of information to come out. If you had any like comments on what your personal reaction was to that being released was. And then also, sorry, you can just pick one. As far as like historic ufology, like less geopolitical, but like, what would you say is the most interesting historic, like crash retrieval or crash landing, event? Would that be something like 1933 Italy, Roswell, Kingman, Missouri? Those are my you can just pick one. Thanks. Sorry.
Well, I guess it's easier to pick the one. I mean, I'll start with the back one. I think Rendlesham is interesting just because it seems to be the most well documented, and even Lou has drawn very close attention to the fact that the individuals associated with that got medical benefits from the government explicitly for their UAP, for their injuries associated with being in close contact with what was admitted to be a UAP by the U.S. government there. So that to me it was related to our nuclear equities in Great Britain. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, so that's clearly fascinating to me. I'll take it in reverse order. So the signal exchange, the one you're referring to, like the U.S. Air Force sort of gatekeeper, quote unquote, right? That one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have. I have to refresh my memory exactly the full content of that. I guess it just sort of confirmed a lot of what I kind of had known from different directions. Obviously, a little bit more detail there. And yeah, I think it sort of painted a little bit more of an explicit picture of exactly like the contours of like the bureaucratic sort of factional sort of complicated mess that's going on here, where there's lots of people that are very motivated in positions of power that are like working to try to like get accountability of these activities from within the military command chain, and it's this kind of it's a bureaucratic kind of tug of war and wrestling match, and you can kind of see that it's like, okay, people are trying to like suss out who's got this, who's doing this, like why is this it's actually this over 1950 some memo that they're pointing at as a reason why they have authorization for lying about these programs, etc. So yeah, I mean, it kind of just adds a little bit more detail or kind of color commentary to the broader sweep of the of the situation, as I see it. And yeah, the former one is like the more philosophical case, right? How do you reckon with whatever this is? And of course, that very much depends on like, well, whatever this is, right? We haven't like a lot of this has been the process, the object level question of like, well, if we accept, as a factual predicate that there are technologies of unknown origin associated with non-human intelligence in our possession, we've been trying to figure out how they work. There's clearly an advanced intelligence that's the progenitor of this, whether we've interacted with that directly, whether we've only interacted with its avatars or representatives or psychological kind of manifestations or whatever, right? Like there's something there that we have to account for, and then of course you look at the Lou Elizondo sorts of stuff everyone points at, like sober, he dodges the sort of timeline questions. You've got a whole breed of folks though, and I sort of I'm in this camp where a characteristic pattern of human psychology, especially in groups, especially in sort of groups that are considered kind of an out group, is they desire a sort of a grand revelation that sort of proves them right, and it's a grand redemptive moment where they're kind of brought out of the wilderness. There's the "I told you so." There's also the kind of sense that their personal identity is now validated, right, by the wider social community. And so there is a strong sense of psychological belonging that fuels all sorts of social cultural formations that create in the future of the sort of the work of this group, or this vision of the future, as this kind of redemptive revelation, right? And it's not just religious; it's like in any like even sporting events. Like we're gonna win the Super Bowl. Like next year, it's gonna happen, right? Like human psychology is very much future oriented and orienting groups around like discrete events where their group will get a payoff, right? And when you hypercharge that psychology with sort of this grand cosmic, essential, almost existential drama, that there will be capital G disclosure, there may even be contact, there may even be radical change to our technological state. It could be almost existential. Like the stakes seem to be almost like hyperbolic, right? Either it's we get wiped out, or we become kind of like indoctrinated or elevated to this almost cosmic or spiritual plane, where we become given we're card carrying members of the galactic civilization now. And so there's sort of bifurcating equilibrium where it's either extinction or cosmic destiny. It's ironically the same sort of pattern I see with the AI discourse. It's like either AI will create a cosmic will create a super intelligence, will result in kind of our colonization of the universe, and actions we take now essentially have an enormous amount of sort of moral weight, because whether it's a benign intelligence that has our values, or whether it's a malign intelligence that just turns the universe into sort of dead computronium, whatever, like there's a huge amount of at stake in it. It's either humanity, we all sort of upload to the cloud and we all live forever, or AGI, artificial intelligence, like wipes us out. And so the same sort of pattern of belief formation I see in sort of the existential or redemptive stakes in AI, and in the UAP conversation are there, right? So this is not like an assessment like, well, okay, well, which is likely to be true? Like, are we gonna like, is it somewhere in between? Or, but I just like I tend to resist falling into that psychological buckets, because I think it's such a characteristic pull for human psychology. Like we want there to be this grand revelation, sort of this eschaton, and so like I then retreat to in sort of more philosophical modes like Stoicism, right? Sort of equipoise, right? You go back and you read the Greeks, you read Epicurus, you read Marcus Aurelius, and they also lived in an environment where there were folks that were taking very extreme, very definitive, uh, positions on like the structure of reality and the metaphysical composition and the role of the human in reality, and there were like very strong disagreements and almost like like purges in different schools of thought. And the Stoics were kind of like, okay, guys, like there's certain limits to human knowledge. We have to get through our day without being sort of overwhelmed by all the metaphysical, existential questions, and we just have to if we don't have sufficient evidence to kind of resolve the question, it's just you just have to kind of hold it out there and just like proceed day by day, step by step. And that's kind of where I am, right? It's just kind of like you have to live your life, you have to do your things. The position of humanity in the universe will work itself out. Find meaning in your day to day, right? Picking up the kids, take them to soccer practice or whatever. I think those are I think much more quote unquote meaningful activities to engage in than constantly ruminating over the existential stakes of the future of humanity. It's good if it's like intellectually satisfying, but it can be psychologically, I think, self-destructive if it's not calibrated, right? So this is where I look at this and I see this could also be a problem that from the disclosure side, right? Like if the government or just larger elements of civil society they're trying to
Like
broaden this.
ontological shock or something, like something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the ontological. I mean, I actually think ontological shock is a bit overplayed. I mean, in the sense that if you look at Twitter, like people kind of believe, oh yeah, did the aliens actually land in that mall in Miami? Like a lot of people believe that, right? People, like are kind of, I think, already kind of desensitized to the possibility of aliens and whether they actually believe it or we just live in a post-truth society, right, where people just kind of drift through the feed and some sort of miasma of sort of semi-real images. I don't know. That's a larger problem. But I think it's more about how people reckon with their worldviews, right? Their sense of self, and especially if if there are existential stakes on the line, right? And humanity has we've gotten through a pretty existentially risky 20th century, right? Like we weren't just like all of a sudden like living in Eden and then we unlocked one little like secret and now it's like all the problem. Like humanity's been rolling from catastrophe to catastrophe, skating by the skin of its teeth. And now it's like pressing pedal to the metal and hoping that like there actually is a bridge at the end of the cliff, right? So I don't know, like NHI doesn't necessarily change my general observation on the inherent stability of human civilization, right, on this rock flying around the earth, right? Like I think we have a lot of responsibility to kind of steer towards the middle path in many ways. I don't know, I don't have any great spiritual observations there other than trying to find equipoise and some stoicism in the face of inherent uncertainty.
You put that so beautifully, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining UFO Twitter Week. This has been a space that I'm sure we'll be unpacking for days, if not weeks to come. You've posed things, you've phrased things so articulately with such education and background as well. And I really just want to say thank you. I'm sure Astral is thankful as well. We've had so much traction on the space, and the one word I'm going to go to sleep thinking about is cosmic destiny. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll collide again in the near future. But thank you for everyone tuning in. There are a couple more spaces happening right now. I think we're spoilt for choice on the lineup tonight. But as always, take care of each other and be kind to each other. And yeah, cosmic destiny. Good night, all. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, guys. Great space.
Good
Awesome.
night.